Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. Today, I'm going to share with you some findings that we have gathered over the years from a study we did on providing conditional cash transfers to young women in South Africa, and sort of some lessons learned about what works for HIV prevention in young women. So I think we all are aware that young women are at incredibly high risk of HIV infection. When we look at 15 to 24-year-old women, we know that, even though this slide is from 2010, the data sadly is very much still similar today in 2021, that young women have much higher incidence than young men the same age as themselves. And, this is a conference on adolescence, but I think thinking about cash transfers and why adolescents are at risk, there's a lot of changes going on in context that can increase risk. And these are places potentially where I think cash transfers can help as a structural intervention to decrease risk for young women. So things like leaving school, leaving home, particularly entering first relationships, first pregnancies. But some of these things can increase risk economically for the young woman, particularly because we know that young women are less likely to have job opportunities post-secondary school. But even during secondary school, they may be, more likely to drop out of school or have less decision-making power in their relationships, particularly in first relationships, which can set up patterns of risk throughout the trajectory of their lives. We know that there's changes in the brain, and we actually wrote an opinion piece about 2 years ago on cash transfers and taking a developmental perspective, because the way the brain is changing during adolescence can influence decisions people might be making. So somebody who's in their early 20s with children might be making different decisions with the cash they're receiving compared to, say, a young woman who's in high school and, is thinking more about peers and peer pressure and things of that nature. We also know that the context of adolescent sex can affect risk, right? So, and these are things where cash also can come into play. So episodic sex is less likely to be protected, limited access to prevention and knowledge. And I think just that a lot of young people perhaps are inexperienced. And that's something hopefully I'll share with you from some of our findings that I think as part of just growing up and learning to be independent young adults, that cash can be a really important part of that process and conveying skills and confidence and helping in the transition to adulthood. So we know that there's a number of social determinants that influence risk. And I think that particularly some of the areas where cash can help are things around education and schooling, obviously helping with reducing poverty, and also surprisingly, and I think this is very context specific, but factors related to gender inequity and violence. And then, other things that we know are important and often neglected are mental health and the role of alcohol and drugs. So what do we know about cash transfers and education? One, I think there's a very solid evidence base that we know that being in school is protective, particularly for young women when it comes to HIV risk, but also other things like older partners, transactional sex, pregnancy. I think there is a solid evidence base there. We also know over many, many years of cash transfers in the development arena that cash can help kids attend and stay in school. And the evidence base is strong there. So this is a review from quite a few years ago, but Sarah Baird and colleagues did a review of cash transfers. And in 2013, at that time, there were over 35 systematic reviews and evaluations, again, just emphasizing the point globally that cash can increase attendance and enrollment in school, and that these effects tend to be stronger for girls than for boys. So we conducted a study, actually this started back in 2011, so almost 10 years ago, to look at cash transfers as a mechanism to keep girls in school with the idea that this was going to reduce HIV risk. And this was a randomized control trial in the northeastern part of South Africa, in Agincourt, South Africa. And we were looking at HIV incidence as the outcome. And we were basically providing a cash transfer conditional on schooling. So if young women in high school attended school, they received a monthly payment to themselves and their caregiver caregiver also received a monthly payment. And we looked at a lot of different outcomes in this study. Just to give you a sense of who the study population was at enrollment, they were, high school students. So on average, they were young, 15 years of age, and about only a quarter reported ever having had sex. About 3% had HIV at enrollment. 9% had ever been pregnant. And I think just emphasizing the vulnerability of this population, almost a third were orphans. About a third reported food insecurity, and something that really influenced the outcomes of this study was the existing social protection that the government of South Africa was already providing. So this research study came in and provided cash to young women and their parent guardians on top of the fact that 79% of homes were already receiving the child support grant, which is a cash transfer the government of South Africa provides to poor and vulnerable families in South Africa. So that, really influenced our outcomes. And I think one of the findings and overall take homes for you all with cash transfers is context. Context really matters when you're thinking about how these programs can have an impact on young women. So this is sort of the quick takeaway from this study, and there have been a lot of papers published. But basically, we did not see any impact of the cash transfer on incidence, so new infections of HIV or genital herpes. But and maybe that wasn't so surprising. That was our hope and what we were wanting to see. The bigger surprise was that we didn't see an impact of the cash on school attendance. So, I showed you the review from Sarah Baird showing, 35 plus studies, overwhelming evidence that cash transfers improve school attendance and enrollment. And we didn't see that. But interestingly, what we did see is really, really high attendance in both arms of the study. So over 95% of young women in the control and the intervention arms stayed in school. And this is in contrast to girls in the surrounding area where secondary school attendance, is about 80% and definitely declines with age. So there was a study effect going on here. And we can talk about that in the discussion. Why I think part of this was the high social protection that already existed in this area. And that I think, thinking about adolescence, there were a lot of other social reasons why young women were not attending school that were not necessarily related to cash, which is interesting because some of our preliminary data suggested that was a driver of why girls were not staying in school. And I'll get into this more, but some of the big findings and surprising were that cash significantly reduced physical violence from partners in these young women. We didn't see that it reduced transactional sex or older partners, which were mechanisms that we thought the cash, could help affect. I will say there were differences, but they weren't statistically significant. At the end of the day, though, true to our hypothesis, schooling was protective for HIV. So we have a number of papers that Marie Stoner, who's a colleague, has published from this data set, showing that girls who dropped out of school were significantly more likely to acquire HIV after school dropout, and that was really driven by having older partners. So, mixing with different networks, so that schooling was really protective in the sense of that girls are kind of in this protective environment. And if they are having sex, it is with their peers who are less likely to have HIV. Okay, so what are some of the things that we've seen since these findings that were a little bit disappointing at the time? We did see that the cash increased household consumption and girls' economic well-being. So this is just, you can see that basically, households that got the cash were significantly more likely to be spending more, both total expenditures and food expenditures, and they're like an index of economic well-being, they did better. And particularly those who were poor at baseline did significantly better. So the folks that were more poor when the study started benefited more from the cash, not surprisingly. This is the results of the physical violence analysis that Kelly Kilburn did. And I think what was interesting, physical violence was the most prevalent outcome in this study. And we saw that the cash transfer reduced physical violence by 34% in this population. So a really big effect. And you can see that basically in this picture below, this figure below, here, if you can see here, this is the control group and the intervention, those getting the cash. And these are different levels of violence. And just to show that it wasn't like the cash just reduced less severe violence, it affected all forms of violence, so all severities of violence at the same rate. And interestingly, in a mediation analysis that Kelly did, we saw that really this effect was driven in this population by young girls not engaging in sex or having fewer partners. So the idea that we could not see that it was, young women were in these partnerships and the cash then changed the dynamic, maybe like stopped violence that might have been in that partnership. Instead, what we saw was that these young girls, remember, who are living at home, they're not married, they're not, cohabiting with partners, were making different choices, right? So they were choosing to either not have sex with partners or to have fewer sex partners. So I think that's an interesting and important finding. And I think we're seeing that from other trials of how cash can impact younger women's decision making. And I think the mechanism for violence can be different for married women and older women who are cohabiting with partners. And we have seen that and can talk about that in the discussion. I think getting a little bit more into why and how cash can impact adolescents and young women. This is work by Catherine McPhail. We had a big qualitative component to this study. And interestingly, again, in this context, which could be different from other countries and other contexts, we saw that the vast majority of young women indicated that they made their own decisions about how they spent the money. Very few indicated their boyfriends had any role in decision-making about the cash. 80% indicated that they spent the money themselves. And we really, this study, there was a lot of concern about giving cash directly to adolescents. Not that many studies had done that at this point. And we had a lot of monitoring for social harms and potential bad things that might happen from girls getting the cash. We really did not see that in this study. So, what came out, and if you read this paper, there's some really poignant quotes about cash transfers for adolescent identity. So it gave them this sense of independence from family and status within their peer networks. It was probably the first time many of them had their own money to spend how they wanted. And this was really important developmentally in terms of giving them self-esteem. They have control over something in their lives for the first time. And that was really powerful. So here I'm just sort of like summarizing what do we know about partner selection, because although the quantitative results suggested that transactional sex in older partners weren't significantly reduced, it does seem in our mediation analyses that cash influenced partner selection. And Marie Stoner did some qualitative analysis showing that, young women talked about increased decision-making power in relationships. Again, this sense of self-esteem and self-efficacy. So that seems to be important, and it can influence those mechanisms. Waru Gishane, who is a colleague, she's now at University of San Francisco, did some work on a cash transfer study we did in Tanzania. And in that qualitative work, again, which was slightly older young women, so not in school, but still 18 to 24, young women talked a lot about how the cash gave them control, so they weren't so dependent on male partners. And again, I think we talked about, earlier, I talked about how from the 068 data showing that, the cash transfer, I think even though we didn't see it, it helped them stay in school. Being in school reduced the risk of having older partners, which again, in this decision-making milieu could influence, that they'll have less decision-making power. So in particular contexts where schooling is lower or there's less social support, less social protection in the area, and it really can help girls stay in school, that certainly can influence HIV risk. So this is just to re-emphasize that we saw the strongest effects of this program for the most poor. So what you're looking at here is that, we did not really see significant effects of the cash on this is sexual relationship power, depression, and hope for the future. And then this is having a partner, an older partner, transactional sex. We did see a significant reduction, although somewhat small, on any partner. But interestingly, particularly for some of these sort of psychosocial mental health outcomes, girls who were more poor or who were poor at baseline, we did see a significant effect of the cash on sexual relationship power, on reductions in depression, and on increased hope for the future. So again, the idea that these programs, which is sort of how they were originally designed as social safety nets, can have stronger effects for the most poor, even in settings where poverty is very prevalent. And lastly, I just want to share some data we have on combining cash with other interventions. And this is, I think, sort of confirms what Lucy Kluver and colleagues have found in their work. But this is some modeling work that Marie Stoner did, just showing that if you combine something like the child support grant or a cash transfer with, in this case, a potential intervention to reduce depression, and with increased parental support, so caregiver care, that had the biggest reductions on HIV incidence. So this was sort of saying, like, what kinds of interventions could have a major impact on HIV. And again, combining cash with caregiver support and mental health care really seemed to be significant. So yeah, so in summary, what do we know to date? We know context really matters, right? Doing cash transfers in a context where school attendance is really high, a cash transfer may have less of an impact on school attendance because people are already going to school. If you already have a really high, strong social protection program, then additional cash transfer programs for young women may have less of an impact. I think there's no doubt that schooling is important for girls. It has multiple benefits in life, including HIV prevention, and cash transfers in some contexts can significantly increase that. So continues to be important. In this context, we saw that cash transfers really helped reduce violence. And again, I think that is important to know your context and to monitor and be careful about that, because that may not always be the case depending on the situation. But in this community, in this context, it significantly reduced violence. Cash can improve self-esteem and increase choices, particularly for younger people, for adolescents who are just entering into these new life experiences. Again, it has the biggest impacts on the poorest, and combining cash with other structural and psychosocial interventions can really have a big impact. I just want to thank the host of people over the years that have helped generate this knowledge and made this study possible. And I'm going to thank the funders, NIH, that made the study possible. So thank you so much.